Big news for anyone who loves the history of D-Day. Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours has just launched a brand new tour that visits the D-Day beaches and lots of other sites in rural France, and all from the comfort of a luxurious cruise on the Seine River. Now, we ran this tour in 2024 and it was a huge success. It sold out in a matter of weeks. So now we've rolled it out again for 2025. But this time, there'll be 3 departures in June, July and September, giving you 3 times the opportunity to join us. The cruise is on board the luxurious Amadeus Diamond and begins and ends in Paris. Over 8 days, you'll enjoy the history, scenery and culture of the beautiful Seine River. But as an exclusive offering just for our passengers, you'll enjoy 2 full days touring the D-Day landing beaches in both the US and British sectors, plus daily seminars on board the ship that unpack the history of D-Day. And like all our tours, you'll be hosted by one of our expert historians who'll bring the story of D-Day to life. And if you've been on one of our tours before, you'll know that our historians really are the best there is. This is an exclusive cruise and places are extremely limited. Visit battlefields.com.au to book your place today.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Enjoying the great outdoors can come with a few pesky inconveniences. Sarna Bug Bite Patches are here to help. Sarna's latex-free peel and stick patches are kid-safe and contain skin-soothing ingredients. The Bug Bite patches are designed to help prevent picking and scratching. Did you know Sarna is the #1 dermatologist-recommended topical anti-itch brand? Shop Sarna now at Amazon.com.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Hello and welcome to another episode of BattleWalks as we walk across the great battlefields of Europe. A special episode this week. This week is Anzac Day, so we're going to focus on something pretty important for Anzac commemoration in France. It's the Australian National Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux, the most important Australian memorial to the First World War in France. And joining me to talk all about it is my co-host Pete Smith. Pete, welcome.
Hey Matt, nice to be back again.
It's a good one, mate. Between us, we're responsible for sending a lot of people to this memorial. I organise it from Australia through my tour company, and then you guide them to the Australian National Memorial in France. It is the essential site on the Western Front for Australian visitors, isn't it?
Well, I think more than Australians, because we now have the Sir John Monash Centre, which we're going to obviously talk about, and it's such a superb location close to Amiens. So everybody should visit the Australian National Memorial, as they should the Canadian National Memorial, etc., etc. But it's a great location and one that we both know very well.
I like these ones that we do, mate. These sites where we walk a specific site across, rather than crossing a battlefield, we walk through a site, we visit a memorial. There's something special about dedicating some time to these great monuments on the Western Front.
Well, I think this one especially, there's an awful lot to talk about. So if we were to add it into a battlefield walk where we were actually walking the battlefield, then this would be a 2-hour episode.
That's a good point. There's so many of these places that I think we it's not that we just scratch the surface, but we there's only so much time in a day, and maybe that means multiple visits are the way to take in some of these great memorials. I felt a little bit the same when we did Vimy Ridge, for example. That site is huge. You could spend hours. It was the same when we did Tyncott Cemetery. You could spend hours walking around and still not take it all in. So maybe multiple visits are the key to getting the most out of these great sites. But today, the National Memorial, the Australian National Memorial in Villers-Bretonneux. Why don't we start? Tell us where we are, Pete. Why is the memorial located where it is?
Okay, well, we're very close to Villers-Bretonneux. I'll explain why in a little while. And a little village called Fouilloy. I think it's Fouilloy is what it looks like, and I think it's pronounced Fouilloy. Let's go for Fouilloy. Who knows? It's a suburb of Corby. That's much easier to say. So it's between Corby and Villers-Bretonneux. It's on a hill. During the fighting, it was known as Hill 104. It's just a gentle sloping hill, nothing spectacular. But the views from it are spectacular in a landscape that is fairly flat. Then to be on this ridge, and certainly looking back towards Amiens, you get a superb view all the way back to the city of Amiens. And you understand why it was so important to recapture, to hold this ridge, which is what the Australians did in 1918. So we're talking about the fighting that took place here on the 24th of April 1918, so the very famous fighting on 25th Anzac Day. So it's it was, and that has to be one of the major reasons why it was placed here, because it is a link to the landings in Anzac Cove. Slightly obliquely, but it is still a link. Very successful Australian fighting, stopping the Germans from getting any further, holding them there, forcing them back from getting any further towards Amiens, which was crucial that they should be kept away from Amiens. So it was a location that Talbot Hobbs, who was the general in charge of the 5th Division, he was an architect in civilian life, and he was tasked with a committee in finding locations for the divisional memorials, all 5 of them, but also with an eye on a national memorial. Where should he put a national memorial? And so Villers-Bretonneux became a fairly obvious location because of that connection to Anzac Cove, because of I suppose the site itself, the fact that it's on a ridge with great views all around, can be seen from all over, and that it had to include all of the divisions. So all 5 divisions needed to have been in this area, and around Villers-Bretonneux and the fighting in Le Hamel, which is almost immediately afterwards, this is the area where the Australian Corps will really find its place on the battlefield. And so all of these things happening here. For a long time, it was suspected that the National Memorial would actually go on the ridge at Poitiers, and that certainly was tougher fighting and greater casualties there. If you are putting in a memorial where you have a lot of casualties, not always a good reason, I think, for placing a memorial, but certainly Poitiers was seen for a long time that would be the right place, but of course it couldn't be, because it's not all of the divisions. You know, the 3rd Division is missing from the fighting there, as is the 5th Division. So it was decided that this Villers-Bretonneux was the correct place to place the memorial.
Pete, it's interesting when we talk, effectively what we're discussing here is a hierarchy of importance of these battlefields that Australians participated in, that which is the one that sums up the greatest achievement of the Australian forces during the First World War. And I tell you what, Villers-Bretonneux certainly has to be up there. The famous counter-attack by the light of the burning village on the 24th, 25th of April, as you say, the connection with Anzac Day, and the great work that was done in the surrounding fields by all the divisions. Do you think Villers-Bretonneux now has de facto become the most important battle Australians participated in because of the location of the memorial? Is that a fair assessment of that battle?
It's a very good question. It's a very important battle because it is stopping the Germans. It's also, I have to say, it doesn't just involve the Australians, the Canadians, the British. Everybody's involved in stopping the Germans at this point, but very specifically here.
I don't think any of those countries were there, Pete. I think it was all Australia, wasn't it?
Of course,
we stopped the Germans single-handedly.
Of course,
I've been to the Monash Centre. I've seen that.
Yes, we'll talk about that later. But yes. So I mean, for Australia, it is an important location, and I think it was an important location because Australian troops will effectively be in this area, moving backwards and forwards across this landscape as Australia slowly pushes the Germans back along with everybody else. As we push the Germans back from the 8th of August onwards, the Black Day for the German army. Well, Australian troops that are being pulled out the line, being rested, the rear echelon guys that are bringing up supplies, they're all in this area. This becomes an Australian landscape until well beyond the end of the war. No, it doesn't just finish, people don't just disappear. So this is a landscape that would have had Australian troops all over it for a long time. And it's one of those issues that you have to say, would the people of Villers-Bretonneux, who are no longer there, you have to say they've been evacuated, be aware at that time, immediately after the fighting, that it had been Australians that had effectively saved the town from going under German occupation again for a long period of time? And the answer would be, well, probably not. But when they started to come back after the end of the fighting, when the Germans had been forced back, then they would have met all of these Australian guys in this area, and it would have become very obvious that this had been an Australian campaign around their village. So I think the connection is more than just the fighting, and a lot of people think it's just all about the fighting, but it isn't. It's about Australians being in that area for some considerable time after the fighting has moved away.
It certainly is an Australian hub, this area in 1918. And I remember the first time I visited Villers-Bretonneux, I was introduced to this incredibly old lady in the village who was a small child at the time of the war, who was talking about her recollections of men in big hats, was how she put it in French, walking around the streets of the towns in the area. So this certainly is a very very strong Australian connection throughout 1918 in this region.
It's very sad at the moment. This week is the Anzac week, coming up to Anzac Day, and I've just seen photographs online and photographs in the newspapers of the village itself, Villers-Bretonneux, all decked out with Australian flags and little kangaroos and things all over the town for themselves. Because there are no Australian visitors here, obviously. In fact, there are no visitors full stop. I can't even get there. It's too far outside of my range of, I can only go 10 miles. So, very sad. But they're still putting on the show for nobody. So I think that's very laudable, and it's a great shame that nobody can actually witness there will be a service in this a very small service, private service almost. The mayor and a few people in the centre of the square. There's nothing actually taking place. I don't think there's anything taking place at the memorial, and yet these people are still putting out the bunting and putting out the flags.
Well, we should pay our respects to the people of Villers-Bretonneux here, who do an incredible job. And long before Australians were coming for Anzac Day dawn services, it's only 2008 was the first year there was a formal dawn service at the memorial at Villers-Bretonneux. Up until that point, the only Anzac services were the ones organised by the local people in the village. So for decades, effectively since the end of the war, the people have remembered in Villers-Bretonneux, and they've done a wonderful job. Why don't we talk about the memorial a little bit, Pete, about the history of it, because it had a checkered history before it became the grand memorial that we see today.
Well, I think the first thing to comment upon is its inauguration, because its inauguration tells you a little bit about what's gone on previously. It's not going to be inaugurated until 1938, so it's the last of the big memorials to the missing to be built. And it's considerably last. Most of the others were finished in the late 20s, early 30s. So this is being finished just before the cusp of the Second World War, which is very sad in a way. So let's go back to the beginning and talk about. We've talked about Talbot Hobbs, the officer who was tasked with finding that location. Well, by 1923, he'd kind of found the location. He'd reported back to Billy Hughes, who's the Prime Minister, who approves it. And I just put a little comment here that by 1921, the Ulster Divisional Memorial commemorating the Ulster Division fighting on the Somme had been constructed, and so that was a large tower. So it's quite interesting to show you how quickly they got off the mark. So how theirs completed by 21, and yet 23, we're still discussing where the Australian Memorial should go. We make a decision, then we have to find an architect to design it. And it was put out as an open competition for architects in Australia to try and create a design. And a chap called William Lucas was successful. It was his design that was actually picked in 1925. So we're moving on again. Unfortunately, two things are also going to happen. There's going to be the big financial crash will take place of the Great Depression, which will mean that there's really no money to build in Australia that can be used to build it. And the second thing is that Hobbs himself and Sir Fabian Ware, who was running the Imperial War Graves as it was at that time, are not keen on the design either. So poor old William Lucas gets sidelined, effectively. He was not happy, to put it mildly, but he gets sidelined. 1929, the French approve the location and approve a rough idea of the design of what it's going to look like. 1930 is when it is suspended completely, so it all stops. 1935, so you can see how we're leaping forward all the time. 1935, Lutyens basically is picked, and Sir Edwin Lutyens, he's the one that has designed several other enormous memorials, perhaps the most famous for the British, the Thiepval Memorial to the missing on the battlefield of the Somme, and he will be tasked to complete the site, because he'd already designed the cemetery and the reception buildings, I think I'm going to call them, at the entrance to the cemetery. They'd already been created and designed, so it seemed to make sense for him to get the commission. Didn't go down overly well in Australia. There were an awful lot of architects in Australia that felt it should have been an Australian architect that designed the Australian Memorial. I'm not sure I agree, because Lutyens was at the height of his power. He was the number one architect within the British Empire, I suppose. And so as far as the guy to do it, then he's got the right credentials. That's for sure. We get to 1935. He starts that design. The design is passed and the building commences. And then it didn't take that long. 1938 inaugurated. So that's the history of the memorial. So it was a slow process, stop and starting. But again, what we get in the end is a superb memorial, I have to say.
Well, why don't you describe it to us, Pete, so for people who haven't seen it, they can know exactly what we're talking about. And like always, jump on Facebook and the web and have a look at pictures of these things we're talking about, because until you can picture it in your mind's eye, you're probably not aware of what a spectacular memorial it is.
Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk us into the site. So first of all, we've just parked our vehicle and we're going to walk into the site. Now, this has changed in recent years because with the building of the Sir John Monash Centre, this visitors' centre, they don't like us calling it a visitors' centre, it's an interpretive centre. This centre that's tucked in behind the memorial has meant there are also a reception area where there are toilets and you can buy your headphones if you need, because, more about that as we go in, but you can actually be guided by a headphone set on your phone across the whole site. So we're going to enter the site through these reception buildings up a stairs, and directly in between the two reception buildings we have the Stone of Remembrance. So for those who've listened to the podcast before, they'll know that for a larger cemetery, you will have a Stone of Remembrance. It looks a little bit like an altar, but it's known as a Stone of Remembrance, and you'll have the large Cross of Sacrifice. And in this cemetery, we have the largest Cross of Sacrifice. And all of this can be seen from the stairs as you're walking in. You're looking into the cemetery. So there are two parts to this, the cemetery and the memorial, and they form a site in their own right. But of course, when was the cemetery completed? Well, the cemetery was completed by about 1928 at the latest. So it's 10 years before the memorial is completed. So the cemetery was already here, and the cemetery is not an Australian cemetery. Now that surprises a lot of people. They think, well, this has to be an Australian cemetery because this is an Australian memorial, which it is, the Australian memorial to the missing of France and to the efforts of Australia on the whole of the Western Front. So it's a very important memorial, but the cemetery is a Commonwealth War Graves cemetery. So it's a mix of everybody. We'll do the numbers slightly later. But that's what you're looking at. So you walk into it, two big reception buildings at each side as you go up the stairs. And again, people look at these reception buildings and say, well, what are these for? They don't do anything. Yes, we have the registers in there that tells us who is buried in the cemetery. Well, they're shelters. You have to think that these architects thought through the practicalities. I suppose you have to remember that these architects thought through the practicalities. And so when you arrived at the cemetery and it's pouring down with rain and you've walked from parking your vehicle, which was a little further away in the old days, into the cemetery itself, and you can go into these reception areas, shake out your brolly, take off your mat, give it a shake, and wait for the weather to ease before you walk into the cemetery and up to the memorial, which is at the top end of the site itself. When we walk in, we normally walk up to the Stone of Remembrance and about face, because one of the things that you need to do is to start to understand why they picked this actual location. Yes, it's where Australian troops will fight and fall as they approach and start to climb up Hill 104, but it's also a superb location for the view back up the valley, and this valley is the valley of the Somme that will take you all the way to Amiens, and of course that's what they're defending. They are holding the Germans from getting up this valley, so you can start here by also looking behind and do a little bit of a talk about Villers-Bretonneux on our left as we look towards Amiens, Corby on the right. So it's a superb location. It's very white, I have to say. I haven't described the colour of it. This is Jurassic limestone. And again, one of the issues that, I suppose, changes the way that it looks is that originally it was decided, or it was hoped, that the stone would come from Australia. Now, you can imagine William Lucas, as he designed it, he is designing this Australian architect, he is designing it using Australian stone, but the cost was astronomical. You can imagine to build this enormous tower and the walls that go with it, then the cost would have been too much. So the stone is in fact French Jurassic limestone. So it looks very much like the headstones. It's the same stone that the headstones are made out of.
Well, let's continue our walk, Pete, because I think it's a little bit unexpected as well that you sort of crest this hill and you're walking through a very large cemetery towards this memorial. You don't actually see very much of the memorial when you first arrive because it's sort of hidden behind the hill. But just talk us through what it's like to make that, a relatively long walk. It's probably a few hundred metres from the front of the cemetery all the way up to the memorial.
Well, I think it's clever as well, because even though I've said this is not an Australian cemetery, because we are in the Australian National Memorial, the first 2 blocks of graves on each side of you, so there's a big lawned area in the middle, the blocks of graves on each side of you are all Australian. And so straight away you get an Australian feel. You're amongst, sadly, the dead of Australia almost immediately. And that puts it in its place. After that, it starts to change, and you'll get a combination of everybody you'd expect to see. So soldiers from a few from South Africa, Canadians, and British. And you have to say that the split is in the main is Australian, Canadian, and British. We're going to only see the graves of 2 New Zealanders. There are only 2 New Zealanders buried here. And they are also the only 2 Second World War casualties. They were aircrew in a Mosquito that crashed very close, and they were buried here. So there are only 2 New Zealanders in the whole of the cemetery. And as we walk up the graves on each side, you can stop and go and read some of the inscriptions. And of course, if we were to start discussing who's buried here, then this would certainly go on for a lot longer than its 45 minutes or so. We will talk about a few of the characters buried here later on. You then get to the Cross of Sacrifice. And the Cross of Sacrifice is there were various size crosses. This is the largest one. It's got a sword on both sides, so that Crusader sword is on both sides of the Cross of Sacrifice, because the cemetery is now all around us. It's on both sides of us, and in front of us and behind us. And what we can also see is that the Cross of Sacrifice has been patched up slightly. There are dinks and dents and batter marks in it, and you can see where it's been filled in areas. And, of course, this cemetery was inaugurated and completed in 1938. Well, sadly, it will fall straight back into a battlefield again in 1940. And the French had an observation platform at the top of the tower, because that's what we're walking towards. We're walking towards a tower. And at the top of this tower, the French in 1940 placed an observation position, and so it was actually became part of the battlefield of the Second World War and was very badly damaged. And so we can see some of that damage that's been patched up, and in fact a decision was made to leave some of the damage so it's very, very visible. So you can see some of the bullet hits on some aspects of the architecture. Even some of the graves have chips out the back. If it damaged the front and the inscription, then the headstones were replaced. But we can see that damage on the back of the headstones as we continue the walk towards the memorial. The ground's now starting to level out slightly. We've climbed up. 2 flags in front of us. The French flag, it's their landscape, and the Australian flag, as you'd expect. Now, they are outside of the cemetery. They are part of the memorial setting. Because you're not allowed to, one of the decisions that was made was flags will not fly within cemeteries. So we are now just leaving the edge of the cemetery and approaching the memorial itself.
One of the things I wanted to say about that walk, Pete, and that was brilliantly described, thank you for that, is that when I was first visiting this, it was a very shaded, tree-enclosed cemetery as you walked up. There were huge trees all the way down the cemetery, and you actually were walking under the boughs of these trees. And then there was a decision to cut the trees down, and let's talk a little bit about that, because as I understood it, they wanted to replace the trees in preparation for the centenary in 2018. But the last time I visited it, the trees were still pretty small and spindly, and it completely changed the look of the cemetery.
It did indeed, and it didn't just change the look, it made it a little bit more uncomfortable. This is obviously a ridge, it's quite open, and when the wind's whistling across there, which it does quite often, then there were also quite high hedges on each side, and they were removed as well, and the trees were the horn beams, good solid trees. And it gave, as you quite rightly said, it gave an utterly different feel to the cemetery, much more bleak. It felt bleaker to me. Now, the trees have been replanted. There was a worry after they'd been removed that they would not be replanted, and I suspect, actually, I don't know for certain, but I suspect they possibly were not going to be replanted because there was a cost element to having trees. They drop leaves, they drop branches, they disturb graves. And I'm not so sure that a decision wasn't made that it would be, it would look better without them, and certainly would be easier to manage without them. But anyway, whether that's the case or not, certainly a lot of people complained the trees were put back in. But we're looking at another 90 years before they'll be back to what they were like in their prime. And there was a discussion that took place that said the trees had been removed because they were becoming dangerous. I watched them taking these trees down. There was no rot in them. There was nothing wrong with these trees whatsoever. So I think it was a decision that was made perhaps quickly and perhaps wrongly. But anyway, in a few years' time, a very few years' time, a lot of years' time, we will have the trees back again, and it will be back as it had looked before. But it certainly did alter it considerably to what it had looked previously.
It's quite extraordinary how it changed the feel of the cemetery, and in the negative. It was as I said, when I first started visiting it in the early 2000s, it was an absolutely stunning site with these huge trees. And now it is a very exposed, wind-blown site. So again, I'd encourage everyone listening to jump on the web and have a look at the then and now photos to compare what it was like. But hopefully, as you say, it won't be too long before those trees are at least in some shape or form back to a style that they were before.
I have to say, one other thing I should just say is that interestingly, yes, they gave you protection from the wind, but it can get very hot there as well in the summer. It's all relative, I understand, for Australians that are listening to this podcast. But it does get quite hot there, and you do need shade. And certainly that was the other thing. You could stop underneath the trees as you walk through the cemetery, telling little stories about some of the soldiers that are buried there. And now for the whole of the walk that you do up until you get to the memorial itself, then you're fairly much in open sun, and not quite as pleasant as it used to be.
Well, let's walk now towards the memorial, because by this stage, once we've reached the flags, we can see the whole memorial in front of us, and it's an impressive structure.
It is indeed, and it needs to be, because this is the memorial that commemorates Australian effort. Now, I'm going to be very careful when I explain what we're actually looking at in front of us. So we're looking at a high wall. How many metres high would you say, Matt? I'm not very good at my metres, so...
Yeah, it's probably 15, I'd say.
Yeah, so 15 metres high wall, runs in front of us, left to right. It has, again, entrance or buildings at each end, which are shelters again, originally designed to be shelters. So if you walked up through the cemetery, you got to the top and it started to rain again, then you have little shelters there as well. The tower in the middle, it's a mixture of classical architecture and Art Deco, 1930s Art Deco. So I quite like it. If you like 1930s Art Deco, then you'll enjoy the tower and the memorial itself. Emblazoned on the top of these walls, we get all of the battle honours for Australia on the Western Front. And this is what confuses people. I'm going to come back to that in a second. This is what confuses people, that the names on the memorial of the missing, because these huge walls in front of us carry the names of the missing, it's the missing of France only, and yet the names above it cover all the battle honours, including those that are in Belgium. And those soldiers, Australian soldiers who are missing in Belgium, they are on the Menin Gate. So it just confused people a little bit. They don't understand straight away why we've got all these names underneath, and we've got then the names of the campaigns in Belgium above. But it's because this is the national memorial, and the second use is as a location to place the names of all of those Australians who are missing in France, and they are named on the walls. Now, going back to the battle honours, there is one battle honour missing, and most people will notice it straight away because it is now seen as such an important action. It's the very first action of Australians on the Western Front, and it's the Battle of Fromelles, and that is not on there. So you have to immediately ask yourself, why isn't it on there? If this is a listing of all of the battle honours, well, you could say Fromelles has its own memorial at VC Corner. There is a memorial to the Australian missing, and it's also a little memorial to the fighting there. And we also later on built, in recent years, have the Cobbers Memorial Park. So we have two memorial parks there. Does it need to be named on here? Well, of course it does. The reason why it's not on here is because there was an attempt, I suppose, to downplay the Battle of Fromelles because it was such a disaster. So many casualties, so pointless an action. There was a certain effort to downplay it. If you've done that at the time, if you've done that during the period of the Great War, then at the end of it, when you're planning a memorial to commemorate Australian effort, you can't then suddenly say, oh yes, perhaps we should mention Fromelles because it's not really been talked about at that period. So it's not on there. And I think it's a shame, but it tells a story in its own right.
We could do a whole podcast on the issue of the naming of Fromelles and battle honours to do with Fromelles because it's been such a controversial subject for so long now. The very quick summation is that the nomenclature committee that at the end of the war they had all these complicated battles and actions, and they had to try and group them and organise them in some capacity. And so the committee that did that decided that Fromelles would go under the Somme battle, the Somme 1916. That would be the battle honour because it was to support the fighting in the Somme, even though Fromelles is nowhere near the Somme. And you're right, there was certainly an attempt there to look away a little bit. I won't say cover up. A lot of people said there was a big cover up. It wasn't the case at all, but it's certainly an attempt just to look away from Fromelles a little bit. And I've got to say, I understand the thinking at the time. With a century of hindsight, we now feel like it was disrespectful to the men who fought there. But I've read lots of accounts from the men who fought there, and not too many of them wanted to look back on Fromelles with any sort of glory. They looked back on it with absolute horror. And I think it was quite distinct from other battles they'd fought in, where just nothing was achieved except thousands and thousands and thousands of people were killed. And so I think the nature of, for even the people who fought at Fromelles, was that it was just such a disaster that it was not something to be commemorated. And so, for better or worse, the decisions were made that Fromelles would not be listed individually as a battle honour on so many memorials, with a couple of key exceptions. Most notable is the 5th Division Memorial at Polygon Wood in Belgium, which includes Fromelles as the first battle honour. But with that exception, the men who fought at Fromelles and their commanders did not want to highlight it. They did not want to cover it in glory as a battle honour, and so you don't see Fromelles in many locations. And
certainly the Australian government wouldn't have wanted it to be brought to the attention of the Australian public, if possible, because it would have killed, in a country that has a volunteer force, it would have killed volunteering. It wouldn't have done a great deal of to encourage people to volunteer with what was perceived as the disaster of the fighting at Gallipoli. And then the first action that Australian troops are involved in on the Western Front to also have a disaster, that would have, I think, caused a big problem for recruiting in Australia.
I always think it's important, Pete, that when we look back on these things, that we don't put our current lens over the decisions that were made a century ago. And I think anything you look at, any of the information you look at, suggests that just about everyone involved in the Battle of Fromelles felt at the time it was such a disaster, we should just move on from it and not highlight it as a place of glory or where there was great achievement. It was just a disaster, and people wanted to move on from it. And you see that across the board. You see that in the reports from the men, you see it in battle honours, you see it in constructions of great memorials like this one. So, a very interesting point. But of course, all the other great battle memorials, battle honours are there for the Australians on the memorial. Tell us about some of the other ones that you'll see as you scan the walls, Pete.
Well, it's everything. So it runs from left to right, so it's running in date order. So on the left-hand side, we have Poitiers, if that's perceived to be the very first action, then Bullecourt, and on we go. I'm desperately trying to think of the order. Bullecourt, then Messines, then 3rd Ypres, and it will be the Menin Road, then Polygon Wood, then... you carry on, Matt.
and then onwards,
and onwards, yeah,
and then of course all of the 1918 battlefields. And by the time we get into 1918, we're starting to get into some very specific and very important, but difficult to recall off the top of your head actions. But all, as you say, from 1916 on your left, scanning all the way around all of the battles leading up to the end of the war, and Montbrehon in 1918, the final Australian action. So it's a good summary. When I take people there, it's a great. One opportunity to just scan the entire breadth of the achievement of the Australians in one place. Yeah,
it's a great aide-memoire, and so that's easy, running from left to right, but so are the names. So obviously, if you're a relative, and we take many relatives to this memorial, and we've got to then find the names where they will be, well, Australia... very simply ran from the 1st Battalion to the 60th Battalion, and that's the order they're in. So on the left-hand side, we will start with the 1st, and the 60th is on the right-hand side. And then we have things like the corps in front, so the engineers and the artillery are also right at the start, the flying services at the start. And at the end, we have things like the machine gun corps, trench mortars, medical services. So it means it's very easy to find somebody because it's also alphabetical, by rank within each battalion. Now, it sounds a little complicated, that, but it isn't. It means that you can, as long as you know the rank and the battalion of the person and the name, obviously, of the person that you're looking for, you can find those names on the memorial quite easy. Now, oddly, I've been struggling to try and find out how many people are on that memorial. Now you think, well, that's easy. Surely we must know exactly how many people's names were put on that memorial. Well, we do, but is that correct for now? And the answer is no, it isn't. So what do I mean by that? Well, of course, they have found and identified multiple soldiers in that period from when this was inaugurated in 1938 to modern times, to today. And they made the decision not to remove those names from the memorial because it's unsightly. And you have to say there's only one that I can think of where we did remove the names, and that's the memorial to the missing at Thiepval, Lutyens' other great memorial, and there they took the names off for a period, and so we can see patches. You literally chisel a name off because you found him, he's no longer missing, he shouldn't be on the memorial to the missing. You put a little patch in there to cover over where the name was and move on, but you can see the patches, and so it looks unsightly, and you have gaps in the list of names. So the decision was made at this memorial not to remove the names of people that have been found. So it means that the total is not correct any longer. So I've got down here 10,982 names. Those are the names that are on the memorial. But now there's only 10,710 who are still missing. And that's up to 2021 at this present time. So it's reduced considerably because we've been identifying people by either finding their graves or being able to identify them by information about their headstones. So in other words, a soldier has got a headstone, it says an unknown Australian soldier, and we now, through a method of looking at documentation and paperwork, have discovered that we know who he is, and so those names have mentally come off the memorial, but in reality they are still on the memorial. Does that make sense?
It does indeed. I think that was very well said. It's the nature of remembrance, isn't it? It's ever changing, and it's some wonderful work has been done by people who've mostly just private citizens who've gone out to try and basically with bookwork try and identify some of these people. So it's constantly changing. I'm sure it will in the future too as technology improves, as building expansion continues, and more of these battlefields are encroached on by modern buildings. They'll find more bodies as they build roads and gas lines and houses. And also the technology that enables us to do research will discover who more of these people are. So I think it's quite wonderful that it's a constantly changing situation with the names on the memorials.
It is fascinating because it does make it very difficult. And in fact, in preparation for this podcast, I went to lots of different websites and looked at notes and different figures. I've got about 8 different figures from different locations, but I think it depends on when that article was written. Because and also you have to say, we've also realised that we've missed people from the memorials of the missing. People are missing who are not on the memorial. So we have an element of adding people to it as well. There is an addendum to this memorial. So we get people coming off, and we get people going on. So it does make it rather difficult to keep ahead of the game.
Nearly 11,000, I think.
Yeah,
is the
that's what it says. I think
nearly 11,000 names on the memorial.
Yeah, broad brush.
And, I think it says that it even says that on the memorial itself. In the inscription that the names of nearly 11,000 men of Australia who are recorded on the memorial. Tell us a little bit about the tower, Pete, because it's quite a striking feature of the memorial.
Yeah, but so before we actually climb up the tower, because we can walk up the tower, I'm very often asked, is there a lift? And the answer is no, there isn't. I'm then asked, how many stairs? And I don't know off the top of my head, and lots of my clients have told me over the years, having counted them, but I still can't remember how many stairs, but it's quite a few, to put it mildly. And I don't necessarily go up there always myself. No, I loiter downstairs and show people names on the memorial. That's my excuse anyway. So we can climb up inside the tower, and as we enter through a beautiful gateway, the gates are open, so you don't actually notice them, but it has beautiful bronze gates that are open. We can see some of the damage that has been left on the tower, because the tower itself was pockmarked by shell fire and machine gun fire during the Second World War. Anything that damaged the naming on the panels, then it was repaired. And interestingly, for years I told people that new panels were placed, but it must be about 10 years ago now, they removed some of the panels to actually replace them because they've been damaged. So the recent panels were removed, and when they removed those panels, we realised that the original names were beneath them. So they didn't remove them, they refronted the whole memorial. So the original damaged panels are actually behind the ones that you now look at today if you were to visit. So it was quite fascinating to see that. So anything that was that had a name on it, anything that was crucial to the actual, I suppose, the design, the concept of the memorial, then that was repaired and replaced. But they left lots of bullet hits on the tower, so it puts it in. I think it enhances it. It tells you a little bit more about later history, the history of the building of it, and then the damage and what happened during the Second World War. And then in its own right, it becomes a memorial to those that fought and died in the area during the Second World War. So I quite like the fact that they'd kept some of the damage to it. Just as a matter of interest, the cost of the renovations in the 1950s were half the price of the original building cost. So it was originally quoted at £30,000 to build, and it was £15,000 to renovate it in the 50s. So nearly half of the cost again to repair the damage of World War II. So we walk to the top of the tower, and we get spectacular views in every direction. It's a great place to go, so it can be a bit drafty at times, but it has got cover above you, so if it's raining and it's not windy, then you don't get wet at the top. We have an orientation table, a bronze orientation table, or it's think about it, it's stone with bronze inset, telling you how far to Paris, how far to Melbourne, how far to London. So it's just interesting in its own right, and to all the major battles. It gives you direction as well. So that's kind of helpful, so you know which way you're looking. But we can look in one direction. We're looking towards Amiens, the place that's been saved. If we're looking in the direction of Amiens, to our left is Villers-Bretonneux. We can see where the fighting has taken place. To the right is down to Corby, which was not taken by the Germans in 1918, but becomes again an important centre for Australian effort and future effort from there. So we can see to Corby. If we about facing the direction that the Germans are coming from, we see a gentle slope, and just over the top of it, we can see the top of a church spire, and it actually looks like a little triangle, but it's the top of the church spire where the fighting on the 4th of July took place at La Hamel. So that is the church of La Hamel, and that's why we can look in that direction. So every direction we are surrounded by Australian effort, really. So it's a great place to spend some time at the top of the tower. You need to, because you need to catch your breath. When I used to walk up on a regular basis, which I must start doing again because I need the exercise after this layoff, I find that when my clients are asking me questions when we immediately get to the top, it's rather difficult to answer because I'm struggling for oxygen. But it's all part of the fun. It's well worth the efforts to get to the top there.
It's an extraordinary view when you get up to the top there. And we should mention as well that this is where Anzac Day services are held every year on the 25th of April. And one of the great Australian experiences is to see a lone bugler at the top of that tower, highlighted by a spotlight in the pre-dawn light, playing the last post. It's absolutely extraordinary, and it's one of the most important places for Australians to go and climb that tower and look out on just that Australian area of achievement and sacrifice. It's always a bit confusing to me though, because it feels like the location of the memorial, it's north of the town of Villers-Bretonneux, so it feels when you're standing there that the Australians must have moved through Villers-Bretonneux and then come in this direction as their next stop as they advance. It's actually not the case at all. They advance from the fields sort of immediately in front of you when you look out of the tower, and swept through and took Villers-Bretonneux and the fields on either side, and you're now in the fields north of the town. So it's a little bit confusing for people when you talk about the direction that the Australians came in their attack, and even indeed where the trench lines were, where the front lines were, because of the location of the memorial in relation to the village, it can turn you around a little bit. But just a wonderful spot to stand, and as you say, not just the fighting at Villers-Bretonneux, but all of that incredibly important fighting around the time of the German Spring Offensive, and indeed the start of the big advance that ended the war. Just a great spot.
It is a great spot, and interestingly, you can see enormous distances. And on a good day, and preferably with a pair of binoculars to help you, you can actually see Lutyen's memorial to the missing on Somme battlefields. So you get superb views. It's easier doing it this way. You could, from that memorial, to look towards Lutyen's memorial on the Somme. You can see it. Looking back, you can't see the actual Australian National Memorial if you're doing it in reverse, because it's a very light colour and it doesn't stand out, whereas the Lutyen's Memorial is made out of brick on the Somme, so it does stand out and you can spot it. Distance, you can see enormous distances. It was planned very carefully and it works.
Well, we're going to go back down the stairs now, Pete, and we're going to take a left in through a little archway, and we're going to visit the newest feature of the Memorial and Cemetery, the Sir John Monash Centre. Let's talk about this. And I'm I have opinions about this. A lot of people have opinions about it, and I'm going to give my honest opinion about it as we walk through it. So let's start by describing what it is and what it does, and then we can talk about its importance and significance.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I mean, the great luxury that I have is I live here, and obviously I guide here, and I've been up there even when I'm not guiding. I pop up there for a coffee and to have a look around the memorial and to go and look at the building of the Sir John Monash Centre. And we all had an idea of what it was going to look like, and we all kind of were worried about how it would disturb the actual, if you want to use the term, the sanctity of the memorial and the cemetery. Would it alter that feel of it? And it most certainly doesn't, to the extent that I've had people that I've met later on who have been up missed the sign to say where the Sir John Monash Centre is, because it is tucked in behind the memorial, and also it's dug into the ground, so it's almost below ground level. It's just slightly above, but it has that feeling that it's below ground level, and you can miss it completely. So it was very, very cleverly designed to be behind the memorial and not to impinge on anything that was there.
Before we go on a little bit, Pete, I'm going to go back a step from an Australian perspective here, just to explain why this even occurred in the first place. So, Australia, since the probably 1990s, has been the most prolific builder of memorials on the Western Front, and for good reason. That for far too long we overlooked the Western Front, the sacrifice on the Western Front. It was all about Gallipoli. Anyone who went to Anzac Day services in the 1990s would know that Gallipoli was the only place that Australians had ever fought in their entire military history, it seemed. That there was a real focus on Gallipoli and absolutely not enough on the Western Front. So that was redressed, particularly in the 90s, when we started building memorials, the Memorial Park at Fromelles, for example, the Memorial Park at Hamel, and a whole range of other memorials sprung up on the Western Front to redress that imbalance. A great thing. It now means that every Australian major battlefield is marked. You can go there and pay your respects at all the Australian battlefields. As time went on, and governments get involved, there was this real feel now, and especially as more tourists started visiting the battlefields from 2008 onwards, when they held the first Anzac Day dawn service here. It's when my company started, we started seeing thousands and thousands of Australians go to the battlefields, which is wonderful. And like always, when this starts to occur, governments get involved. And I'm not saying this critically, I'm just saying this is just what happens. Governments get involved and say, well, we need infrastructure and we need facilities and things like that. So in the last 10 years or so, the Australian government has been quite active in building what they call the Remembrance Trail across the Western Front, and spending a lot of money upgrading museums and making sure there's access and toilets and food and beverage and linking all these sites together in the hope that people can walk from one, or not walk, but travel from one to the other to visit all the key Australian battlefield sites. But there was constantly a feeling from every government that came along that there was something missing. There was no key Australian museum or place to go to have the full story told. And so for a long time, they decided that at the National Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux, eventually they would build an interpretive centre which told the Australian story. And that opened a couple of years ago on the site. It's the Sir John Monash Centre, Interpretive Centre. And it's quite a remarkable place. So that's the backstory as to why it's there. Let's carry on, Pete. Why don't you describe... You've been... I've only been there a couple of times. You've been there dozens of times. Why don't you talk about exactly what it is and what it does?
I'm going to describe the entrance, and then I'm going to describe what it does, or my perception of what it's doing. So I can't explain to you how cleverly designed this is. It is very clever. So you're going to walk basically down a gently sloping slope to the right or left of the memorial. They vary it sometimes as the entrance. They can both be used as entrances. As you start to walk down this slope, you get the feel that you're walking into a trench, and that's obviously intentional. And you also start to hear trench noises because they have piped music playing into these. Well, it's not music, piped noise playing into these areas. And it's machine gun fire, and it's soldiers. You can hear soldiers shouting and talking, and you start to get the feel that you're actually entering a trench. It's bare concrete, with the imprint of timber on that concrete. And then if you look carefully, there are various bricks and things set into the concrete, and the bricks have things, names like cobbers and lice and smoker and Furby, and there's all sorts of little things like that, like the names and things impressed into the brickwork. So it's just very clever, just attention to detail. And then you approach the doors, the entrance doors. As you get to the bottom, they open automatically, so you don't put no pushing against doors, and you enter a very marble and open central area where the staff will greet you and make sure that you're kitted out with headphones because you need them. You have to have a telephone and a headphone before you're sent on your way into the actual experience, into the centre itself. Fantastic for other reasons. There are toilets. There is a great coffee there. You can sit down. And so from a guiding point of view, this is where it actually is interesting. I don't have to do anything. From now on, I don't do anything other than make sure that my clients are going to have a look at it. So let's just think about what are they actually going to go and see. Well, they're going to see the story of Australia on the Western Front in great detail, right the way from recruiting in Australia. There's a section about recruiting, and this is done through a series of archive film footage, a bit of reenacting, some reenacting film, some cabinets that are full of some artifacts, and then very clever floor displays of maps. It's all singing, all dancing. You have to say, in the building process, I was able to go and have a look at the computers that drive all of this. It is like being on the deck of the Starship Enterprise. It is truly cutting-edge technology. To get round it all, to watch every bit of film footage there, to go and look at the artifacts that are on display. There's also a central film that you go into a room where the doors close behind you and smoke comes up through the floor, and to give you that feel of battle. Very, very clever. But you're looking at 4 hours. If you were to stay in there from start to finish, 4 hours. So that would be, I suppose, my biggest issue of the site itself is who can afford 4 hours to be in one building when you're visiting the battlefields? And I would say very few. Perhaps some of the independent travellers who have got lots of time, maybe staying in Amiens for multiple days and going out and visiting all the different aspects of what they want to look at connected with the Great War and other things, of course. Then that's fine. But for those of us who are on a battlefield tour who have lots of things to go and see, and we want to get out on the ground and walk the landscape that the Australian soldiers walked, then it works, but it means you have to pick and choose what you're going to look at when you're in the site itself.
It's a good description, Pete, and I'm going to give my opinion on it now. And you don't even necessarily have to give your opinion on it, since you have to go and every day go and work with the people that are there. I'm a little bit far more removed. I'm not a fan. Let me just come out and say that. I'll also say that I'm also on my own with this. That just about every Australian I've ever taken there absolutely loved it. So I am completely on my own on this, but I'm not a fan of the interpretive centre for a number of reasons. Firstly, the technology. Like, they've just gone a technology route. There's no signs on the walls. Everything is just screens and technology. Firstly, I think that will date very quickly. I think what we call cutting-edge technology today in 5 years is going to look a bit clunky and not work so well. Secondly, I have never taken a group of people there where the bloody thing worked as it was supposed to. The first 20 minutes or half hour of the visit is mucking around with the staff trying to get the apps and headphones and smartphones and everything to work so that people can look at it. But the main thing I'm going to say about it is I'm disappointed that there's no context. And I don't want to criticise just for the sake of being critical, but we have an obligation here to remember these men that we're talking about, and I find that there's no context whatsoever. It's completely the Australian story. So they'll talk about the Battle of Pozieres without explaining how it fitted in with the larger Battle of the Somme, or what the British were doing at the time and the Canadians. And I know that would start to get it beyond the scope of what it's doing, but it is a completely Australian focus. And I also think it's in the wrong place. If this museum was in Melbourne or Canberra at the Australian War Memorial, it would be an unbelievably brilliant addition to our understanding of the Western Front, because it shows so much about what goes on the Western Front. But I think here, when you're in the middle of the battlefields and when above, just near you is this huge memorial, and there's also a very large cemetery with all these bodies lying there, do we need videos and smoke coming out of the floor and dramatic music and sound effects to understand what it all means? You've just walked through a cemetery with more than 2,000 bodies. You've just stood in front of a memorial with 11,000 names on it. Do you then need... Do we seriously live in an era where, unless we've had the video experience with the reenactors and the smoke and the sound effects, we don't understand what it all means? And I would like to think that we're smart people and we do understand what it means, that when we see those headstones, when we see the inscriptions on that memorial, that we are smart enough to understand what it all means. And so I think if this memorial was back in Australia, this museum was back in Australia and telling the story from the Australian War Memorial, or from the shrine in Melbourne, or from the Hyde Park Memorial in Sydney, I think it would be an absolutely wonderful addition to our understanding. But on the battlefields, I think the all singing, all dancing is perhaps a little misplaced. Anyway, that will be my relatively diplomatic discussion of it. But as I said, I am on my own. Everyone that ever goes there comes out going, oh my God, that was just so amazing to see what the Australians did on the Western Front.
I think there's an age issue connected with this, is what I would say. My experience of taking lots of people in there over the years it's been open since 2018 would be the younger you are, the more you're liable to enjoy it, and the quicker you'll get through, because you kind of somehow can pick the bits that interest you, you walk through, you understand the technology, you get it all working quickly, and you're through. The older people are, and this is not being ageist at all, they struggle with the technology. They struggle with things like if you've got hearing aids and getting those to work with the headsets. They struggle in watching that much film. There are not many seats in there, so it means that you have to keep moving, and they don't like standing up for that long. And I tend to find that by the time I've ordered my coffee and I've sat down in the cafe there to put my feet up, then some of my clients have been through and are joining me already, and they tend to be the older ones. So that would be one issue that I would have, and I do tend to agree with some of what you've said, Matt. I do agree that wouldn't you rather be out on the landscape rather than in here? I think that's absolutely correct. But what I totally agree with is the lack of context. There is no context at all of what anybody else is doing at any time. And in fact, so one of my clients, who was Australian but pointed it out, he said, Pete, have you noticed? I think there's only one depiction of a British soldier in the whole of the display, and he's running away. And I thought, yes. It is very Australian. It needs to be. It's in the Australian National Memorial, but perhaps it could do with a little bit more context. Having said all of that, it has grown on me the longer I've been going, and I've come to enjoy going there, partly because it does good coffee, but it does tell a good story. But it just, as Matt quite rightly said, is it in the right place? And I'm not sure as well. I'm not sure it is totally in the right place, but it is absolutely essential you go and visit it. So you can make up your mind. Some people love it and some people don't. And I do tend to find that there is no middle ground. I really like it. I've enjoyed every second of it. Oh, I didn't like that. It was horrible. There's no real middle ground, but thankfully for most of my clients, they fall into I really, really enjoyed it, and can we not stay a little bit longer? And I say, no, we are here to walk on the ground and go and see the battlefields. Follow me. But yeah, it's a great thing. I've come to know all the staff over the years. Fantastic staff, I have to say. The previous director who left at the start of this pandemic, being replaced, she was called Caroline Bartlett, being replaced by Rebecca Doyle. And poor old Rebecca, I've not met her yet because we're not allowed to go up there. And so 18 months later, she has totally been managing the place in the middle of this horrible COVID. So since she's took charge, she's not had a single person over or hardly, and certainly not a single Australian over the doorstep. So yeah, very sad.
I do know Rebecca, and she's very competent, and it must be a very tough gig. Rebecca, if you're listening, it's a shout out to the tough gig that you're doing, but hopefully it won't be long before Australians are back. And I don't want to be too critical. I mean, a big part of the controversy with it was it cost $100 million to build this thing. There's a lot of money, 100 million Australian dollars they spent to build it. And you certainly would never say it's complementary to the battlefields around it, because one minute you're looking at beautiful English gardens in a Commonwealth military cemetery and headstones and talking about the First and Second World Wars, and the next thing it's video screens and reenactments. But lots of people like it, and it's there, and it's an essential site to visit if you're on the Western Front. The one thing it does do very well is it is a site now that people can go to as a one-stop shop. If you are a tour group that's in Paris and you don't have the time to get up to the battlefields, you can now go to Villers-Bretonneux and see the memorial, see the cemetery, and go to the interpretive centre and get the full story of Australia on the Western Front. So that is very effective. So it certainly has a place. But everyone who goes there will visit it and give us feedback about your opinion about it if you've been to the John Monash Centre.
I love the architecture. I have to say, it's. I think I was never particularly until recent years a fan of modern architecture, but this is cutting edge modern architecture, and it's very clever, and I really, really like it. And again, one of the things that you must do, and it's not really signed very well, is you must go out the back, up the stairs at the back, and then go and walk through the gardens around the sides where you get information about the divisions as well. And the final thing they've done, which I really do appreciate, is the gardens have become real wildlife gardens, and they've encouraged, they put wildflowers and things there, and almost throughout all of the year, it is a wild garden out the back, and grasses and things, and there are bees and buzzing, and it's a great place to walk through after you've been through the actual interpretive centre itself. So overall, I'd have to say I'm a fan, really, but I'd rather be on the battlefield.
Well, very well said. Pete, it really brings us to the end of our tour. I see in the notes that you sent through, you've got a couple of small little pieces there that I think are quite interesting, particularly the headstone of Philip Ball, Sergeant Philip Ball, military medalist. But that, nice spot to end. The sentiments expressed on his headstone. Talk to us just a little bit about these additional things that you've got here in your notes.
It is. Well, I've got some little notes here about. We didn't mention the inauguration. The inauguration, it was done by the King. So King George VI, he actually inaugurated it. And I think his wordings were very clever. They rest in peace while over them all Australia's tower keeps watch and ward. I think that was the sentiment was excellent. And also it was broadcast live back to Australia. So, 1938, we're in the period where communication is a lot better. So broadcast straight back to Australia. And then the other comment I wanted to make was, we've talked about them before, the private inscriptions on the headstones, and again, there's some beautiful ones, and there's some very moving ones, and this is one that people tend to go and have a look at. It's on the grave of Sergeant Philip Ball, MM, awarded the military medal, and his parents decided that what they wanted as their private epitaph on the headstone was, "I fought and died in the Great War to end all wars. Have I died in vain?" And I think you have to remember that would have been written at some stage in the late 20s, possibly even the early 30s, when the rise of the Nazis was coming, and it was becoming more and more obvious that there would possibly be another war. And sadly, of course, there was. So you could say he did die in vain. I like to think perhaps not, but his family had that put on his headstone.
It's the walk through the cemetery at Villers-Bretonneux is quite extraordinary. Just there's some incredible headstones on there, and just a range of sentiments expressed. It really is a remarkable place to walk through and spend some time reading those headstones. So don't spend too long in the interpretive centre. Spend your time wandering back and looking through the cemetery, because it really is worth it. And Pete, just an essential site for Australian visitors, an essential site for all visitors. I sent a group of Americans there recently who really enjoyed it, and it's just a fascinating place. And thank you for taking Australians there, and your compassion and your sentiments you express about the Australian achievements on the Western Front. And we'd really encourage, when everyone can get back to the battlefields, that this is a site you go to, particularly if you're interested in the Australian involvement. So Pete, looking forward to you hosting people again on the battlefields. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your contribution.
Yeah, pleasure, Matt.
If there's one thing that my family and friends know me for, it's being an amazing gift giver. I owe it all to Celebrations Passport from 1-800-Flowers.com, my one-stop shopping site that has amazing gifts for every occasion. With Celebrations Passport, I get free shipping on thousands of amazing gifts. And the more gifts I give, the more perks and rewards I earn. To learn more and take your gift giving to the next level, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
Your dining room is the heart of your home, where meals are shared and memories are made. At Ashley, you'll find affordable dining furniture in a range of classic and modern styles. Ashley small space sets and extendable tables are designed to fit beautifully into any space, from cozy breakfast nooks and kitchens to formal dining areas fit for a feast. And with mix-and-match seating options, everyone at your table gets the perfect seat. At Ashley, style is served. Shop in-store or online today.